And like, what inspired you to write this amazingly complex, but also like really beautiful duology?
Hmm. Um, so I kind of stumbled my way into this story. I've been writing since like 2010 is when I like started playing with the novel format. And I had like been picking it up and putting it down, writing as like a thing. And I think it was 2019. I was like, I really want to give it like an actual go. Like I had a few finished manuscripts, but I couldn't like get them past the actual finish line of feeling like they were ready to share with anyone publicly. I shared with critique partners and writing groups and stuff, but so I was like, all right, let's think of an idea. What would be a story I want to tell right now? And I was into tarot reading at the time. I was learning, and I had just gotten a really cool deck. And I had seen some people talking about using tarot as a way to explore storytelling, like fiction wise, not just the stories we tell each other about ourselves. And so I laid out a few like Celtic crosses. I don't know how familiar you are with tarot. That's a very generalized reading
Hmm.
to kind of give me a scope of like my hero and a villain and just trying to like see if it could stir anything up. So I was in that tarot-y space while I was thinking about the world building, and I knew I wanted to have like fun and interesting magic. And tarot and astrology are they're very intertwined in the way you think about things with the elements. But I knew I didn't want to do an elemental magic system. I wanted to try something new
Hmm.
for me. So yeah, those were my two angles. Was kind of like the tarot showing me a glimpse of what the characters were gonna like be going through, and then the astrology angle of magic is how I started thinking about my world building, and that's the whole world was built with the magic, so everything became like really intertwined that way.
Well, speaking of astrology and that magic, like, how did you come up with the different powers for each sign? Like, where did that all come from?
I mean, I would say I was definitely inspired by the Mistborn series by Brandon Sanderson, kind of as like a looking in point of
Hmm.
a complex system that has like multi different types of magic. So that was, I guess, like a foundation for me to think. And then I started thinking about, okay, how do I interpret what are the facets of astrology in a fantastical way? And so astrology tends to be water, earth, air, and fire as
Hmm.
an elemental thing, thinking about energy systems. And because I didn't want to work with the elemental magic system, nothing wrong with them, they're lovely. I just wanted to try something different. I kind of like moved into sort of an Eastern world of thinking in terms of chakra and energy placements in the body.
Hmm.
And that's kind of how I got toward like, the aether is very connected to the breath, which was also a reference point to Avatar The Last Airbender, thinking about movement of energy in that way. Yeah, and so from that point, I thought of my chakra points as like body, mind, heart, and soul. And then I basically went into each astrology sign and I was like, how would this manifest in magic? Well, if I look at the stereotypes and the stories and the traits that we're talking about when we look at these astrology signs, if how would that make sense in a
Hmm.
magical way? And that's how I kind of interpreted each of the signs with their own little ability.
And when we talk about the trines, is
Uh-huh.
that something that like came to your head in terms of like I know a lot with astrology they talk about sun, moon, and rising. Is that kind of like where you got the idea from?
So, in your astrology chart, like if you were to have someone draw up a chart for you, there are relationships between different like planetary systems that are going on at the time. Trines can be, it's when a triangle is created between those relationships. It'll be like Jupiter and the sun and, oh, not, it doesn't do a constellation. So let's say, I'm blanking on planets, Pluto, it's not a planet anymore, Mars will be in different signs and there's a relationship, like it makes the angles. So
Okay.
trines and squares are powerful relationships in that way. And I mean, I'm not an astrologist, so I can't really say like why those relationships are so important, but it helps when you're interpreting the placements of things to say like, okay, well, Jupiter and Mars are in your trine, and they'll say things like that. So that means this is a very powerful moment
Hmm.
because right now they're both ascending or whatever.
Right.
So that's where I pulled that from, was the trine being your relationship between things.
You can tell I know very little about astrology. I know basics. um, so, in terms of writing these characters, which ones did you find were the easiest to write? Which ones were the hardest? And like, who did you like connect with the most as you were writing?
Yeah, that's it's kind of funny because that's each of the three main POVs. Casper's voice always comes to me the easiest. I found his voice the earliest when I was writing, and so for me, he's always the easiest to tap into. Helix can be a little difficult because he's got complex emotions and he's also like a kid, but he's also an adult. So sometimes I can find when I'm writing scenes with him, I have to finagle a little bit to get him feeling correct. And then, funny enough, Talia is usually the one that I relate to the most because her I'm an adult and she's older, so she's the issues she's dealing with and the complicated emotions that she's having are much more relatable to me
Hmm.
versus like Casper, who's very much at the start of his journey and he's a teenager going through all of the stuff, and like I was there, I know what that feels like, but that's not my current experience.
Hmm.
I am very much more related to Talia. I find she has a kind of layered experience with things, and they're all hidden behind anger. And that's very much how I feel when I look at the world.
So one of the things I really, really like about these two books is that the queerness of it is very just there. Like it's not like glaring, like, oh my gosh, this is a queer book. Like it is more about just the relationships between people. Can you kind of talk about your thought process into wanting to make it a queer story, but not making it a in your face queer story, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I mean, I very much wanted to make it feel normalized and make it feel like it was not necessarily part of the conversation. Like it is, but it isn't being spoken about in that way. And that was mainly because I didn't have a book like that growing up. Like it was never normal. It was always a central topic if it was even being discussed, or it wasn't
Mhm.
like this deep, dark, hidden, ugly secret. And I think there's space for all things. It's not even really a context of like, I think we should have normalized queer fiction. It was just, that's the story I wanted for me. Like, that's
Mhm.
the story that would have helped me the most as a teenage kid trying to figure myself out. And so I wanted to approach it from that angle to kind of, if there's anyone out there who needs to feel like it could be normal, like it could not be the center of their universe. Because that's also, I mean, that's always been my relationship with my queerness is like, it's tangential. I've never made it a central part of my identity, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I just it's always been a part of me, but not who I am. I wanted this story to kind of talk about that in the same way.
One of my favorite characters that's on the side, like I always like the side characters because I feel like they give a little bit more to those central characters. And one of my favorite ones is Hector. Um, how did you decide that that him in the way that he is was going to be the partner for Talia?
That was one of those things that like it genuinely just happened. He showed up. That's who he was. It wasn't even like a conscious choice. I didn't like, choose to have every letter of the rainbow represented. It just like when I had the first scene with Hector, that's who he was.
Hmm.
And I mean it ended up being an important facet of like showing that normalized queerness. I wanted Casper to see that, and so it was really helpful as like a viewpoint to show that. But yeah, that was one of those things that like I just I don't know, and I guess in a subconscious way, it was kind of like my thank you to the trans community of just like how powerful it's been accepting myself as someone who is accepting themselves, and just showing me how to do that. So I think that was a big part of like how and why it showed up. But all of those things were kind of like things I could see in hindsight.
Right.
When I was writing, it just, that's who he was. And it was cool. So I like beautiful. So I was like, I like this.
I do. And Hector's such, as you say, he's kind of a cool guy. Like, if you sit there and
Yeah.
think about it, he's pretty cool. Like everyone deserves to have a Hector in their life.
Oh my God, we'd all be so lucky to have a Hector in our life.
For sure. All right, so let's look at Casper and Helix a bit more because in the second book we really get to hone in on them being together, which causes its own bits of friction and goodness.
Mhm.
One of my favorite things with the second book, we get a moment where Hector, or not Hector, sorry, Helix and Casper go to Earth for a vacation, so to speak. That ends up not really being a vacation, and I really like seeing Casper show Helix what Earth is about, and it kind of mirrored what Helix did for Casper when he first arrived in Novolum.
Mhm.
And was that intentional, or did it just happen to do that? Like that parallel just happened to occur?
Um, more happened. My process is very intuitive. I wish I was the mastermind that could do things super intentionally. I do think, I mean, part of it, I understood their relationship needed more context, and there were things that needed to be explored. But I found my way into that much more out of this is what felt like normal. The most I could give myself credit is in mirroring the story structure. I knew that the opening of the first book has sort of like a different space transporting to another space. And so
Yeah.
giving some kind of feeling of that same context, I knew I needed to have that some kind of experience. But yeah, craft wise, it was intuition.
We can see even more so in A Sky So Hollow that both Casper and Helix are broken people. Even if Helix tries to say, oh no, he's perfectly fine, he's very much broken. And did you want the audience to have that imagery of them both going through different types of grief at the same time so that they could help each other?
Yeah. Yeah, a big focus with the second book and why I felt like it was really necessary was showing Helix reaching his breaking point, pushing him, or basically like showing what happens to him because of what happened in book one, and giving Casper the opportunity to kind of show up for him the way that Helix showed up for Casper in the first book. And yeah, I felt like that piece of their story wasn't able to like. I mean, the first book was already long. There was a lot.
Hmm.
I couldn't put
Right.
more in it. But yeah, I definitely felt like that story was left untold, which
Hmm.
is yeah how we got to book two.
Awesome. All right, I have a couple more questions. One is, let's talk about the grotto.
Yeah.
Where did the idea of what that would look like come from? Like, what are you pulling from to create that section of the world, so to speak?
Yeah, I've always been fascinated. I forgot what the TV show is called, but there's been quite a few over the past couple decades where like a hole shows up in the earth and you go down and like there's dinosaurs or it's just like this overgrown tropical paradise underneath the earth's crust. I think that concept is like really enchanting. I haven't done research. It could be very problematic. I don't know. But just as a surface level interest, I thought that was really cool. And like in this situation, we're already below, the surface. This
Hmm.
is inside the surface of the moon. And it was actually so the Farseers are like tangentially mentioned in the first book, but they don't really come into play. But I kind of found them in there, and I knew that it would be an interesting way to kind of explore the world building. And so, yeah, those two things kind of married into like, what if, what would be a very contrasting environment to put Novolum up against because Novolum is pretty austere. It's kind of almost bleak in the way that
Hmm.
it's stone and dark and grand, but also feels a little like a museum. Is kind of how I think of it. Like it's a little bit like, oh, I shouldn't touch anything here. The opposite of that was like wild nature, and so that's what felt would be the best. And then also, I will give myself credit thematically. I knew that I was kind of tapping into moving back towards nature as a way to heal, and I wanted to summon that kind of obviously because I didn't want to. I don't know. I didn't want to have like a big speech about it. I wanted to show it, and that was what I felt was going to be like the most effective at showing that aspect.
All right, I feel like before we end this interview, we have to talk about Jacob.
Oh yeah,
So, I really appreciate with Jacob that he's a villain, but like he's really just someone that went the wrong direction with his intentions were good, but like his how it played out was not.
yeah, yeah. I think villains should be doing the right thing in their own head, and that's the
Hmm.
way to make them the most believable and interesting. And this is YA, so I wanted him to lean into villainous.
Hmm.
And I did that with the sense of mania that he falls into. But yeah, a big part of it was I wanted what he was doing to make sense, to have some sense of like, okay, I actually, like, what if he's kind of right? You know,
Hmm.
looking at what he was fighting against, it makes sense that he goes to extremes because everything he tried to do was being completely diminished and pushed aside. And in his head, he was like fighting for the survival of his people.
It's weird that your books have like a very good deep connection to what's currently going on in the world. I
Yeah.
don't think that was your intention, but it's weird that it
I
worked out
mean,
that way.
I definitely had thoughts and feelings about what's going on, and if this was a way to explore those without truly, like it is commentary, but it's not, and I
Hmm.
think that's what fiction should be. It should have something to say that is relatable. It doesn't have to, but like, I don't know, I think it's useful.
All right. I just want to make one last comment. My favorite line from Sky So Hollow is sometimes family that you build stands stronger than the family that you're given. And sometimes the family you're given teaches you how to hold on to the family that you build. Beautiful words. Very, very wise from Talia. But yeah, that was my favorite quote from the whole book.
Yeah, that was one of the ones. It's kind of like a thematic summary, because for me, this duology is about finding home, about what that means, and the fact that like it's not always something that's given to you or easy or discoverable. It's sometimes something you have to fight for, you have to build, you have to create out of nothing. And each of these characters are doing that from very different perspectives in very different ways. So yeah, thanks. I'm glad you like it.
All right. Well, thank you so much for taking time to speak with us today.
Yeah, I appreciate this so much. This is really cool.